We say goodbye to Las Vegas. We say goodbye to Lusail International, and we say hello to Yas Marina for the Abu Dhabi season-ending race of the 2024 F1 season. And there is a lot to talk about before we jump straight into Abu Dhabi, and we're going to get into it right now. This is Turn One Podcast. We're your hosts, Jeremiah
and Thomas.
Thomas, I don't know how much you were paying attention to these last two races, but everything that I thought about this season is completely wrong, and here's why. For one, in Las Vegas, McLaren was nowhere, and out of nowhere, Mercedes just has this massive pace as George Russell storms away and is just sailing off into the distance like Max last year. Lewis Hamilton comes back from way back and makes his way all the way up to the second spot. We see madness all over the place, and of course, Max Verstappen, without even having to podium, wins the 2024 Drivers' Championship. And it was crazy. The only complaint that I have is that Terry Crews was doing the interviews, and that's fine. I get it. It's whatever. It's Vegas. But the fact that Max Verstappen got just as much attention as the top three finishers was absolutely hilarious. He had his own car as he gets driven to the podiums, and they do the post-race interviews, and then Max just is off getting hammered somewhere the rest of the night.
His night, every interview just slowly got more slurry speech. Just was He needed to keep it together for like an hour post-race, and he just couldn't do it.
As he's crawling onto the plane the next day. Well-deserved, and a crazy fourth championship. That puts him in a massive, his legacy jumps up tremendously just from this next championship. He's up there now with legends, and it's amazing. We saw it coming. He's the best on the grid. He's the best that we've seen in a long time, honestly, since Lewis Hamilton, of course. And even Sebastian Vettel, he had his run, but this has just been an amazing run by Max Verstappen in these past 4 years.
Yeah, not to look too far ahead, we're going to release an episode on our way too early predictions for 2025, so check that out when it releases. But this is a good time for Max. He needed to win this season because we're very unsure about Red Bull's future. And so we knew that the second half of the season, Max obviously did very well the first half of the season, got a lot of race wins. Second half of the season kind of fell off. And then we've seen over the past, 5 races, he's just gone to another level.
He wasn't going to let Lando take it. Not a chance.
No. He kicked it up a notch. He went back to the Max Verstappen of old. He said, I don't care what car I'm in. I'm going to win these races, get the points. And not that it's a blowout, but Lando not getting points in the Qatar race or not getting significant points in the Qatar race really kind of makes it look more like a blowout than it actually is.
Also, for funsies, just to rub it in Lando's face just a little bit, he went on record saying that if he was in the McLaren or the Ferrari car, he would have clinched the championship sooner. I thought that was hilarious.
I'll say this. I got 2 notes on Vegas before we move ahead. Mercedes had a day, like you mentioned. Their best day since they raced at Spa, although Spa was tainted by George getting disqualified.
Yeah.
So them to go 1-2, especially in a race like you mentioned where Lewis started 10th, I believe, and work his way up to second. And then my favorite moment outside of Max's interviews, did you see the interview Max did post-race where Zach Brown walked up and congratulated him?
Oh, yes, I did. What did he say? If you remember what he said, go ahead.
So Zach Brown is is he the
CEO
of McLaren? That's right. CEO of McLaren. He walks up to Max and said, hey, congratulations. Okay. You got your 4th. You beat my guy Senna because, Senna's a longtime McLaren racer. And Max goes, oh, yeah, hey, appreciate that. I guess it's not true, though. You said I could only do it in the fastest car.
That's just right.
Just a real, not even a subtle burn. Just I'm just gonna hand this right back to you because Zach Brown earlier in the season said that Max could only win the championship because he had the fastest car. Max clearly does not have the fastest car this season. It is the 3rd, maybe the 4th fastest car on the grid, and he still wins the championship.
Absolutely, as well as he should have. Dude, I loved that interview because after the season that Max had last year, he just ate it up this year. Every win, because he was winning races last year. He's like, yeah, very nice. good job to the guys in the factory, and the car felt good. And this year he's winning like a regular middle of the season race. He's like, yes, boys, let's go. It's like, okay. So every win just meant that much more this year than it did last year, and I think we as fans just ate it up.
Yeah, he gave us a lot of personality that we didn't have in years past too, which was kind of nice to see out of Max.
Which brings us to Qatar. As the man has already locked down the championship, he says, why not? I'm going to win anyway, and I'm going to take the Qatar Grand Prix. This was hilarious to me because in the sprint race, Lando was leading the whole thing with Oscar Piastri in second, and they actually do a swap in the sprint race where at the very last couple turns, I think it was the last turn actually, Lando gives the spot to Oscar Piastri as paying homage to earlier in the season when the race was still on for the championship. Oscar gave the switch and let Lando pass so that he could continue to fight Max for the championship. Now that the championship's locked up and Lando is able to repay Oscar for doing that earlier in the season, he goes ahead and makes the move. It doesn't affect McLaren and the constructors whatsoever because they still finish 1-2 in that sprint race. It's a win-win in that scenario. I liked that. Now, the rules and regulations changed to where after a sprint race, you can go back and make edits to the car, as qualifying is now after the sprint race, and then you go into the race on Sunday. I loved this rule change for this exact reason, because it's not just a remake of exactly what we saw in the sprint race for the feature race. We see two completely different stories unfold as Max Verstappen takes off in the feature race, and I loved every second of it.
We see that every time we have a sprint. Maybe not every time, but a lot of the times where what happens in the sprint is not what happens in the race. You and I saw that at United States Grand Prix, where Ferrari had a day during the Grand Prix that they did not have in the sprint race, and it's two completely different teams and drivers showing up. I've got this to say about Qatar. Well, one, I have a gripe about sprints that we've talked about before. You mentioned Lando letting Oscar through to get the points. The sprint points are less relevant because it goes linear. It's a linear, progression of points. It goes 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. That bugs me so much. I really have a problem with that. It should be the top 3 get points, and it should be like 8-5-3 or 5-3-1, something like that.
Make it mean more.
Because in a race, you go from 25 to 18.
I can see your point, but if you get first in the sprint, well, I don't know. I could argue both sides. Yeah, I can see your point on this.
Okay. The one thing I loved about Qatar from a track perspective, and then I'll talk for a second about the teams. I love the little gravel traps that are just inset. They're in there's the whole runoff area, which is, asphalt, pavement, whatever. It's painted, different colors. And then you just have those little rectangular gravel traps.
Just a touch.
Just a little bit, like a 2 or 3 foot section. Maybe it's, 20, 30 feet long, whatever it is. And it's right where all the track limits violations are going to happen. I think that is a perfect use of gravel traps. That is what I would like to see done at the Austrian Grand Prix. You don't need the full runoff area to be gravel like we see at Imola or several other tracks along the F1 calendar. Those little traps played into the minds of the drivers more than I've ever seen in an F1 race, because they skid off the track. 1, those things are tearing up their tires. 2, it's spreading rocks and dust and debris on the track. They were worried about punctures, and it slows them down considerably because their car bounces like crazy through those things, trying to get over the curb, into the gravel trap, back over the curb, back onto the track. I think that is a perfect way to implement gravel traps.
There's so much to talk about in this Qatar Grand Prix. I can't even focus on the track really. The action itself. I mean, for one, I want to talk about Lewis Hamilton. This man, by every means necessary, had the worst race of his career, what felt like at least, and not by his own accord, because every time he was out there, he was battling with everything he had. I just think that anything and everything possible that could have gone wrong for this man went wrong for this man, as what was it, Alex Albon's mirror?
Alex Albon's mirror.
Flying off the car, right onto the main straight, right past the start finish line, and Lewis Hamilton, or it was Valtteri Bottas that first ran over it, shattered it into a million pieces. Now there's carbon fiber shards all over the main straight. Lewis Hamilton flies over it, and of course, a couple turns later, tire puncture. And since he's at the very beginning of the track, he now has to go all the way around this thing on a punctured tire, which drops him all the way to the back. And of course, he fixed that, gets back on track, gets running, starts doing his thing, and what happens? Oh, you were speeding in the pits earlier? That's a 10-second stop and go, which is extreme in my opinion. That is the most extreme penalty you can get, as far as I'm concerned. This man then has to pit and sit in the pits for 10 seconds while nothing happens, and then takes back off. Again, very end of the very back of the grid, and you know, he wanted to retire the car at that point, and the guys were telling him, listen man, if you retire the car, we'll pick up a penalty. You can't do that, you got to stay out there. And he was done with the whole day. He wanted to call it, and I don't blame the man one bit. However, he wasn't the only one to suffer from that from the straight incident, as Carlos Sainz also tries to go for a move, swings to the outside or to the inside going into turn one, picks up a couple shards, and a couple turns later, boom, there goes Carlos Sainz's tire. And if I'm not mistaken, at the time he was in sixth, chasing down Pierre Gasly. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. And it drops him all the way back as he now has to stumble all the way around the track, and then he doesn't end up as bad as Lewis Hamilton to where he's at the very back of the grid, but he definitely drops some spots, gets that tire, and of course now his race in terms of finishing as high as he was is now over. And what are your thoughts on this whole incident with the debris on the straight?
So I've got two things for you that are all around the stewards and how the race was run. One, the safety car was way too late. The safety car, I believe, came out 5 or 6 laps after the mirror flew off. We have seen them stop down races for way less, way faster before.
The safety car came out after 2 drivers had suffered punctures already.
Yeah, I don't know what they were waiting on, because it's not like that thing was going to get removed magically from the track.
First of all, it was sitting out on the track. There should have been a safety car to remove it. Then Valtteri runs over it. Should have been a safety car to clean up to the debris. Then 2 drivers puncture their car. Oh, you know what? We should throw a safety car out there because things are going bad. Hello?
The other situation that the stewards, I think, messed up. So there's no more race director per se. There is and there isn't. We saw a couple of these stop and go penalties. You mentioned Lewis. Who else got one? Lando Norris.
Mm-hmm.
What were both of the stop and go incidents related to? Safety issues. Lewis speeding in the pit lane and Lando not lifting under yellow flag conditions. As far as I was able to read and watch videos on, anything that is deemed a safety aspect, the stewards are essentially saying, slap a 10-second stop and go on it automatically. That's where in years past, the race director would have some discretion, right? That's where the race director came in and looked at the situation and said, okay, this merits a 3-second time penalty, a 5-second time penalty. Oh, it does merit a drive-through penalty, which even a drive-through penalty is better than a 10-second stop and go penalty because it's 10 more seconds of stopping and going. So that's, I think, one of the biggest downsides to not having a one-person race director running the show. And we're seeing that in the Qatar race where drivers just get hit with a 10-second stop and go penalty for things that probably should have been a 5-second time penalty.
A 10-second stop and go penalty, by the way,
30
you might
seconds.
as well slap the driver with anywhere between a 30 and a 40-second time penalty.
Yep, because a drive-through is going to be like 23 to 27, depending on the pit length, and then you're adding the 10 seconds of stopping.
Absolutely ridiculous. I think it's the harshest punishment you can do, and it's crazy.
I'll say this. I think, we're going into Abu Dhabi. This is essentially an Abu Dhabi preview video as we've got some chases going on. I think a lot of the constructors came into Qatar finding the limits of their car. You have Ferrari, of course, trying to catch McLaren. You have Red Bull still trying to stay in the picture, although they didn't really play into it. And then you have almost all of the back markers, meaning 6 through 10, trying to just get a spot, a position, trying to just pass whoever's in front of them. I think they all ran their car on the limits. And that's why you saw so many drivers going off track. You saw so many of him hitting the gravel traps. You saw so many of them understeering, looking at you, Lance Stroll, looking at you, Kevin Magnussen, looking at you. There was like 3 or 4 other drivers who understeered and ended up bumping into people. It was so constant. And I think it's because those car setups were so aggressive and the drivers were not ready to run that. So I think it kind of backfired on them. What are your thoughts?
I think that the Qatar Grand Prix, I talked to you about this before we filmed. It feels like there's always one race every season where it just feels like complete and utter chaos is happening. And it's just, that's what it is. That's what this race is. That's what's going to deem people's thoughts when they think about this race going forward. And this was the Qatar Grand Prix for 2024, in my opinion. I mean, they had 5 DNFs. There was just, first of all, Lance Stroll, you're absolutely terrible.
So bad.
He's so bad. It hurts to watch. But that's just one thing, right? So we saw why am I blanking on the second Red Bull or Williams driver? Colapinto. We saw Colapinto with bad luck out there. We saw Yuki Tsunoda getting passed left and right as he drops from out of the top 10 and then continues to drop as Zhou Guan Yu passes him. Valtteri Bottas passes him. By the way, shout out to Zhou Guan Yu, finally for Kick Sauber to get your first points of the season in the race before the final race of the season.
And not just 1 point, he gets 4.
Yeah, that's great. That is hilarious. But this race, I mean, that alone adds to my point that this race was complete and utter chaos. You know, kudos to Lando Norris for getting a 10-second stop and go, dropping all the way to the back of the grid, and then moseying his way back up to end up getting points in 10th place, which I was kind of hoping he didn't because Valtteri had that 10th place spot, and I thought Valtteri was going to get 1 point, but it didn't happen. Anyway, this race, I mean, it was a culmination of, I feel like, the Constructors Championship heating up and them wanting to get as many points as they possibly can to try and take this title away from McLaren. There's a culmination of all the backmarker teams trying to make up as many points as they can to try and get themselves up a little bit higher. Looking at you, Alpine and Pierre Gasly, who had a day. I mean,
Pierre Gasly deserves a shout out for sure.
Absolutely. It was just utter madness.
So, looking ahead at Abu Dhabi, we've got one more race in the 2024 season. There's a couple things at stake here. So, obviously, the constructors is still up for grabs. Max has won the drivers. We can talk about where the drivers will finish, which we can, but the constructors is the main thing up for grabs. Right now, McLaren sits at 640 points. Ferrari has 619. So, they've got to make up a 21-point gap. It's a lot, but it's not crazy if some things happen in Abu Dhabi. Ferrari has to have a day. That's number one. And McLaren has to struggle. It can't be a close race. It can't be the drivers, intermixed between each other, splitting positions. Ferrari's got to be, way ahead of the McLaren drivers to cover that gap. But it can happen. We've seen that happen, several times this year already where teams make big jumps. Red Bull, I want to say, is pretty much locked into the 3rd spot, and Mercedes is locked into the 4th spot.
Yeah, I mean, madness can ensue. Absolutely. We could see Ferrari's DNFing. We could see McLaren's DNFing and or falling outside of the points, and somehow magically, some way, Max win and Sergio get 2nd. And that way, Red Bull could, I guess, statistically still win the constructors. Is it possible?
No, they're far. They're 60 points behind.
Okay, well, then I stand corrected.
Yeah, they're out. I think the other battle to look at is, sadly, for 6th. I think Aston Martin is locked into 5. So you've got in 6th, Alpine, 7th, Haas, and RB in 8th. Now, RB's a little bit far behind.
RB has 0 chances here. I'm going to cut you off. That's not going to happen. But this 5-point deficit between Alpine and Haas is...
Yeah.
Listen, man, I was so heated about this. because I wanted Carlos Sainz to pass Pierre Gasly so bad. Me and my brother, we were cheering on for Carlos Sainz to pass Pierre Gasly because him and I were Haas fans, man. I mean, end of the day, they're terrible. We love them. They had a great season, and we loved every bit of it. Every time Hulkenberg would sneak into Q3, every time Magnussen would somehow sneak into Q3, we loved every bit of it. We ate it up. So to see Pierre Gasly just, in Brazil, we finished 2 and 3, and then, randomly in the Qatar Grand Prix, we finished 5th. It's like, come on, man. Like, you've been bad all season. You want to start being good and jump up and take these huge points? Man, I wanted Haas to get 6th so bad. But for them to get 6th in Abu Dhabi, first of all, Alpine can't get any points at all. Second, either one of the Haas's has to just have a day and get something like 6th or 5th, or they both have to finish in, 9th and 8th to even have a chance at this, because that'll give them 6 points. I mean, it's possible, but man, I don't see it happening.
No, so last thing, I went and pulled up last year's race results just to see how possible the Ferrari McLaren switch is. So one, Max has won this race the last 4 years. So I'm just going to go ahead and say Max is probably going to go ahead and win this year too, just because he's Max and why not? But here's the deal about last year. Do you know who finished second last year at Abu Dhabi? He might be from a tiny little country in Europe that's known for their wealth and no taxes. I was going to
say, I feel like it was Charles Leclerc.
So Charles Leclerc finished second. The McLaren drivers finished 5th and 6th last year. Now, Carlos Sainz finished 18th. He had to retire due to an engine trouble. But if Ferrari can somehow pull off a 2-3 or a 1-3 or a 1-2 and McLaren finishes as they did last year, we got a race.
Nice. Love to see it.
It's possible.
Just for giggles, how far is Red Bull from Ferrari again?
Boy, I cannot do math in my head. Like 38 points. I think I did that right.
So it's possible. Red Bull could finish in second. Not probable, but possible.
Checo would have to have a day of some kind, and Ferrari would have to have no points.
Yeah. So we're looking at a battle for the first spot between McLaren and Ferrari. We're looking at some battles further down between Alpine and Haas. For the most part, V-Carb's locked in where they are. Stake is definitely locked in where they are. I think Williams is locked in. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, they're at 17 points. They're locked in.
So there's two battles.
One last battle. Second in the drivers.
Oh,
Lando Norris.
Yeah.
Lando Norris leads Charles Leclerc by only 8 points.
Oh, yes. Dude, Charles Leclerc gets second. Lando falls down to like, what, 6th, 5th?
This is where Carlos Sainz does his final act at Ferrari as he proceeds just to T-bone Lando Norris on the opening lap. And Leclerc sails off to take second place. Not like me and you did that in a video game ever or anything.
Yeah. By the way, thanks for that. I won the championship that year.
As I just pinned Max Verstappen against the wall.
I needed to beat him in Abu Dhabi.
You needed to win, and he needed like essentially 0 points, and so I just held him against that wall for like 10 seconds. And the crazy thing is, he kind of caught up a little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a story for another time. So we have a battle. We have the battle in the constructors for first. We have the battle in the constructors for 6th between Alpine and Haas. And we have a battle for second between Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris. I'm sure there might be another battle somewhere in the drivers, but I don't think anybody cares about those. So we'll stop it there.
Let us know in the comments, does Ferrari make the leap and pass McLaren? And similarly, does Charles Leclerc make the leap and pass Lando Norris? It's almost one and the same. If one happens, the other can happen.
Guys, if you think that Haas can get its first ever win in Formula One and just take off from Alpine to claim this 6th spot, I'm there with you. All right,
we'll see you.
Bye, guys.